Great. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to the GCOM webinar. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll go ahead and get started here. So again, thank you all for joining us. This is, again, a webinar that we are hosting partially from GCOM side as well as ICLEI USA. We are hosting a webinar series in order to support US communities in reporting to GCOM. And so this is the second session of this webinar series. The first session we went over how to create a vulnerability assessment, climate risk and vulnerability assessment for reporting to GCOM. And today we'll be going over greenhouse gas inventories and really reporting those for your badge requirements, but also for to kind of help communities prepare for planning and implementation of reduction strategies for implementing different strategies to help reduce those emissions. Today, I am joined by the City of Nashville. So thank you, Michelle and Laurel, for joining, as well as Google. So we'll go ahead and get into this session today. And also as a note, this webinar and the GCOM Help Desk and the GCOM Americas project are funded by generous support from the EU. And so we are able to provide this content for you all. Again, so for the agenda today, we'll be going over greenhouse gas inventory reporting requirements, inventorying with purpose, and then we'll also be getting into the Google Environmental Insights Explorer. So thank you again for Mike for joining us from Google. And then we'll be hearing from the City of Nashville, Tennessee, and their process for greenhouse gas inventory. And then we'll get into a little bit of a Q&A. Great. Awesome. And then next, so we're just going to get into the inventory, so analysis and reporting overview. So again, for reporting to GCOM, the main reporting requirements are greenhouse gas emissions inventory, risk and vulnerability assessment, target and goal setting, climate action and energy access planning, and monitoring and reporting. But today we'll mainly be going over greenhouse gas inventories. Oh, I'm sorry. Is there something going on with my screen? Let me see if I can. Okay, let's do that again. Okay, should be fine now. Okay, great. Awesome, thank you so much. Sorry for the delay. Just having a few issues, but there we go. Getting back into the presentation, there are about 5 accounting principles, and I know that this is a lot that is on the screen, so I'm just going to go ahead and give a quick overview of what these principles are. So initially, you want to ensure that for your inventory and following the common reporting framework, you'll want to ensure that you are reporting on the relevant, any information that is relevant to the local situation and reflecting the city's capacity and regulatory context. So making sure that you're looking really at what the city can incorporate into a plan and actually have any reduction strategies and implement those reduction strategies. You'll also want to consider all emission sources or use notation keys for any of the sources that you are not able to collect information for. You'll want to complete these inventories on a regular basis. For GCOM reporting, you'll want to report at least every 2 years a new inventory. Fourth one, make sure your inventories are as accurate as possible. And then number 5, you'll want to make sure you document any of your activity data, data sources, methodologies, you want to make sure that that is reported as well. And so when you're going into your inventory, you complete your inventory and you're going to report on one of the relevant platforms. For many is the CDP ICLEI track platform that folks use. And so the main sectors that you want to make sure that you're reporting, and the ones that are mandatory for GCOM reporting, include the stationary energy and energy generation, transportation, and waste. And so again, when you are reporting on these three mandatory sections, you'll want to make sure that you are reporting the activity data, the emissions factors, and the emissions. And you'll also want to make sure that you are reporting on the sources of those different emissions. And then you'll also want to make sure that when you're reporting your emissions, you are distinguishing between the different scopes. So scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, you want to make sure that you are distinguishing those scopes. And I will say that for scope 3, that's only mandatory for the waste sector. So we'll get a little bit into what is mandatory for each of these stationary energy and energy generation, transportation, and waste. We'll get into what is required within those in a second. And then also for your global warming potentials, you'll just want to make sure that you have listed and reported what those global warming potentials are. So when you're looking at, you have reported your emissions in CO2e, the global warming potentials will be able to help understand the CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions within those CO2e emissions. And lastly, you'll just want to make sure that your boundaries are clearly defined. So this is usually the geographic boundary. So if you're a city, make sure that you are clearly defining it as your city boundary, or making sure that you are identifying the year that you are doing this inventory for and the type of greenhouse gases. So again, that's CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. Great. And so I wanted to get into the stationary energy and energy generation. Now, these are two separate areas that you are going to be reporting. We separate out the energy generation from the rest of the inventory in order to make sure you're not double counting and kind of over counting your emissions. But starting with stationary energy, you'll want to ensure that you are reporting for residential, commercial, institutional, industrial, agriculture, and fugitive emissions. And so just kind of looking at residential buildings for a second, we see here that there are the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions that are required. And so this is, again, looking at for scope 1, your natural gas usage in those buildings, scope 2, looking at the electricity usage in those buildings. And so that would be required for all of these sections. We're going to get a little bit into notation keys in a second, but oftentimes we'll see communities that will report on residential and commercial buildings, the scope 1 and scope 2, and the rest of the institutional, industrial, agriculture, and fugitive emissions. They'll use a notation key because oftentimes your utility will include all of those into the commercial sector. And that's completely fine as long as you use those notation keys, specifically IE notation key. But again, we'll get into those notation keys in a bit. And then again, separating out the energy generation. When you're looking at energy generation, you'll want to make sure that all greenhouse gas emissions from the generation of any grid supplied energy within or outside the city boundary are reported. And this is, again, from if you are a city that has any ownership or partially owns a energy generation facility, you'll want to make sure that you are including this in your reporting. If you are a city that does not have that energy generation, you do not own or partially own an energy generation facility, you don't have emissions for that, just make sure that you are using that notation key when you are reporting to GCOM. And then next, transportation is the second mandatory sector that you'll want to make sure that you are including. And in transportation, this includes on-road, rail, waterborne, aviation, and off-road. So again, all of these are required for reporting to GCOM. But again, if you are mainly looking at on-road, you'll be able to report on your on-road emissions. And if these other sectors either don't occur within your city boundary or are insignificant emissions, you'll be able to use the notation keys for that. But really, again, looking at these subsectors within transportation, scope 1 and scope 2 would be required for these subsectors. And then the last sector that we're going to go over is waste. And so if you recall earlier, I did mention that scope 3 emissions are also required for the waste sector. And so when you look at waste, we're required to report scope 1 and scope 3. And so when you're looking at this solid waste disposal, that can include any waste that is generated within your city boundary and landfilled within your boundary. That's that scope 1. Scope 3 would be if it was generated within your boundary and sent to a neighboring city's landfill. That is that scope 3 emissions, and those are also required to be reported. And again, wastewater is included in this waste sector. So just ensuring that you have your scope 1 emissions for that. And I did want to just mention that if you have any waste, so you say you have a wastewater plant that has an energy generation unit, these emissions should be included as IE in this waste sector when you're reporting, but then in the energy generation sector and the stationary energy sector in your reporting. So if you have that energy generation from a wastewater plant or from a landfill, make sure that you are reporting that in the energy generation and stationary energy sector. And then in the waste sector, you'll be able to use the IE notation key. And so I mentioned all of this about notation keys. Notation keys are essentially used for different emissions or sources that you do not have activity data, emissions data for. And you'll want to use these to ensure that you are really accounting for all of those mandatory sectors that I just kind of went over in the previous slides. So NO you can use for not occurring. So again, if you don't have waterborne or airborne transportation within your community, you can use the NO notation key. And you can also use that for insignificant sources. So if you have, say, off-road emissions, off-road vehicle emissions, if those are really insignificant emission sources, you can use that NO notation key. IE is included elsewhere. So essentially, if your emissions are included in something else. So if I go back to this stationary energy, and I was mentioning that a lot of utilities will provide their natural gas and electricity usage, usually in the residential and commercial sectors, and that's usually it that they provide. For the institutional, industrial, agricultural, and fugitive emissions, you will need to include that as an IE. You will need to make sure that you are using that notation key when you are reporting, and making sure that you note that it is usually included in the commercial sector from your utility. The NE notation key is essentially not estimated. So any emission sources that are just not estimated. But I want to just note that NE is not allowed for any of the mandatory sectors that we just went over. Anything in the stationary energy, transportation, or waste that are mandatory, you cannot use the NE notation key. This will usually count against you in a reporting. So typically, we always recommend to utilize the NO or the IE notation keys. And lastly, there is the confidential notation key. This is again for any type of information that is confidential to some group. So if you're a city with a very large commercial business or very large industrial business, and they are the only one in your community, that data can very oftentimes be confidential and not be something that you want to report out. So you are able to use that confidential notation key for some of those sectors. So I wanted to just quickly go over the most common mistakes that we have seen. This is just from 2021, the last GCOM reporting year. The most common mistakes that we've seen from communities reporting their inventory are incomplete inventories and inventories using that NE or not estimated notation key. So when you're going through and filling out the table, say in the CDP ICLEI track, you're filling out that table. If you say you don't have institutional emissions data or activity data, and you just put a 0 and no notation keys, that would be an incomplete inventory and would count against you. So you'll want to make sure that anything like any sector that you do not have data for when you're going through any of those mandatory sectors and you don't have data, you will need to use a notation key for that. On the other side of that, when you are using those notation keys, just make sure that you do not use the NE, not estimated, because essentially all of the mandatory sectors, they expect to be estimated. And so you'll need to either use the not occurring or included elsewhere. And again, it's fine to use the not occurring notation key for most of those sections that you just don't have emissions for, and especially if they are emission sources that are negligent. And then the last two sectors here are the cities that do not attach activity data or emissions factors. You'll want to make sure that you are including, say, the megawatt hours for electricity usage or MMBTU for natural gas usage. You'll want to ensure that you're including those. You cannot just report the emissions. They also need to see the activity data. Emissions factors are also required to be reported. So usually using the IPCC emissions factors are the best way to ensure that those emissions factors are reported. And then for your grid electricity emissions, using those local emission factors from your utility will also be fine. And lastly, cities that do not attach supporting documentation. So this is when you don't provide an inventory report so that they can see the methodology, sources, things like that. When you don't report that, that would also count against you. So ensuring that you are including an inventory report or including a link to that report that links to your city's website, and ensuring that that link works. Oftentimes we've seen that a link will be included, but it does not work. You click on the link and it doesn't take you to a page. So making sure that that link is supported. And again, most of you may know of these two different tools that you can complete these inventories in. ClearPath is ICLEI's cloud-based report inventorying tool. So you can utilize this tool in order to conduct your inventory. This is for ICLEI members. So if you're an ICLEI member, you'll be able to utilize this tool. And there's also a report. CDP upload is what the name of the report is, and that will be a report that you can use to upload all of your inventory data into the CDP ICLEI track. The Sirius tool, or the City Inventory Reporting and Information System tool, is an Excel-based tool that you also are able to use to conduct your entire inventory. And it is also a tool that has a report function that you can easily insert that information into the CDP ICLEI track. Checking with time, I'm going to go ahead and go through the rest of my slide. So this next section is inventorying with purpose. Essentially, the reason why we are doing inventories. Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty to ensure that we limit global warming below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably 1.5 degrees. And the US just recently, back in April 2021, announced the new NDC, which essentially was requiring a 50 to 52% greenhouse gas reduction by 2030. And so we need to have these different targets in order to support the global climate movement to reduce emissions. And then if you look at a more local level, the Race to Zero is a campaign that is for cities, businesses, regions alike that are working to meet that goal of the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so many cities have been joining this Race to Zero and setting up science-based targets. Essentially, these science-based targets are to ensure that a city can reduce their emissions enough to get to that 1.5 degrees Celsius global target. And I say all this to say, to reach these global targets and to reach your science-based target, you need to have this inventory. And ICLEI for years has said you cannot reduce your emissions. You cannot reduce them with what you have not measured. So you'll want to make sure that you are doing this inventory process to ensure that you have a bit of an understanding of your local context and know what emissions are occurring in your community. So on this screen, I have a typical greenhouse gas inventory, community greenhouse gas inventory from typical US cities. And so as you can see here, transportation is the largest source, whereas energy is that next source. And those are a few of the required sectors for reporting to GCOM. Solid waste is also a required sector. And as we know, that from the most recent IPCC assessment, solid waste methane emissions were a little more detrimental than we had known previously. And so you can expect those solid waste emissions to increase. So you want to ensure that those three sectors are really what you are working towards, making sure you are reducing those emissions. And so what is the best place to start when doing your greenhouse gas inventory? It's very imperative to kind of look at your local context and see in what ways you hope an inventory will support your government, what projects or programs will help your government reduce their emissions, and then where you see your community is just in 10 to 30 years. So these are questions that you'll want to take a look at to ensure having a vision, essentially, of what you want your community to be like in 20 to 30 years. So once you kind of go through these questions, then you'll be able to kind of understand what type of sources you want to include in your inventory and what are the most important sectors to include. And lastly, I just wanted to go over the ICLEI USA's 5 BEGAs, or 5 basic emission generating activities. These are essentially what we would consider the most important sectors to ensure that you have emissions data for. That's electricity consumption, so electricity usage, stationary combustion, that natural gas usage, on-road travel, and then the use of energy in your wastewater potable water and wastewater treatment, and then generation of solid waste. So these are really the sectors that you'll want to be focusing in on, because these will be the sectors that have the greatest emission reduction potential. So you'll want to really focus in on these when you're going through your inventory process, so that you can then move into your mitigation measures, ensuring that you have some strategies that can help you to reduce those. And like I said, energy, transportation, and solid waste are the main sectors that we see most emissions from. So you'll want to focus in on those different sectors to reduce your emissions. So next, I'm just going to go ahead and pass this on over to Google. We're going to see the Google Environmental Insights Explorer, and they're going to talk about how this resource can also support you in inventory.
Hi, everyone. I was wondering if I would be able to get some support as far as presenting my slides. Oh, terrific. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Tavendale. I'm a program manager working on Google Environmental Insights Explorer, also known as EIE. I'm excited to share with you a quick overview of the tool today and some of the data currently available. Next slide. At Google, we are very passionate about building technology that helps people do more for the planet. Next slide. We as data providers and with sustainability being a very core mission to us, so we understand the global state as far as urgency of climate action, and as far as not only reducing emissions, but achieving carbon neutrality. Next slide. And of course, central to this climate action, we understand that 70% of the world's emissions, carbon emissions, are coming from cities. However, there's also just a lack of data and climate insights that are available at scale, which makes it even harder to be able to take informed action. And not only is this data hard to procure, but sometimes it's just not even available depending on the community. And as far as even being able to have access, oftentimes it can be very costly, not only in time, but in resources. And of course, depending on the data set in question, potential switching costs as well. Next slide. And that is really a lot of the premises to why we created EIE, Environmental Insights Explorer, in partnership with GCOM. Our goal is really to provide trustworthy, timely insights to accelerate climate action through data-driven decisions and solutions. Next slide. So now I'm just going to quickly go over our main data sets that we offer in EIE, and hopefully go over in a little bit more detail as to how this could be potentially useful as you will consider your creating your inventories or updating your GHG inventories. Next slide. So couple of basics. EIE is a web-based platform. It's freely available to cities, local governments, as well as organizations such as climate consultancies that are working closely with cities to help them collect their data, analyze their data, and develop programs and strategies. EIE data serves insights across 4 key areas today. Namely building emissions, transportation emissions, rooftop solar potential, and in parallel, we're also developing new insights. Just to give you a taste, some of these include tree canopy and air quality. I'll be focusing more on the top 3 for today's discussion. What's also cool with EIE and what makes it neat is that you're able to sign up and review the data for your community and see what's also available for adjacent or neighboring communities, but you're also able to make adjustments. We have input so that you can see what changes happen when you alter the conversion factors as far as impact on emissions, but also you can download the data that we have available as CSV, so you can start plugging it into various spreadsheets and other workflows to see how our data compares with other data sets. You can sign up for EIE today at insights.sustainability.google. Next slide. And so going through these one by one, let's start with building emissions. With EIE, we're able to estimate floor space and assign a building type category to most buildings within the city boundaries. Floor space is modeled using data from Google Maps that includes satellite and 3D modeling. Residential buildings, as far as our classification goes, we classify it by residential buildings, which include houses and apartments, while non-residential buildings include offices, retail, hotels, hospitals, warehouses, and other commercial establishments. What's also neat with our building emissions, we do take into account mixed-use buildings, and we're able to be able to tell, for instance, if the first floor of a building is retail, but all the floors above it, for instance, are residential, we're able to take that into account in our calculations. Next slide. So in terms of building emissions and our methodology, we first calculate the total floor area for each building type, which allows us to account for mixed-use buildings. We then use region-specific energy intensity factors from the Climate Action for Urban Sustainability tool, also known as CURB, to estimate the total energy consumed to power each type of structure. We're using a blended average of the nearest available emission factor data, and we're assuming a mix of grid-supplied electricity and stationary combustion energy sources. Again, referencing CURB's energy usage breakdown. Next slide. Moving on, transportation emissions. With EIE, we're able to categorize and aggregate trips taken within the city boundaries and the trips that cross the city boundaries using real activity data from Google Maps. Not only are we able to quantify the trips, but we're also able to calculate the vehicle miles traveled. Next slide. And as far as how this really breaks down in terms of our methodology for calculating transportation emissions, similar to agent-based activity models used by transportation planning departments, we classify trips based on origin and destinations to determine travel direction data, namely inbound, outbound, and inboundary for each administrative boundary. We then compute the annual aggregations by city, mode, and travel direction by applying scaling factors for general population and average vehicle occupancies. We then apply emission factors that are available in CURB that contain fleet mix and fuel type distributions by country and region. Finally, we sum the overall carbon emissions by mode as metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents. Next slide. With our data sets, we are actively working with cities and communities around the world to validate our data. The main thing is we always want to be able to see how we compare so that we can understand that not only do we want to make sure that we know how we compare to other data sets locally that cities may be using, we also just want to be able to understand if our models and data processing takes into account some of the local nuances that are just inevitable when you're trying to provide a data for globally at scale. And so what you see here is in terms of data quality, we've worked with partners in cities to validate EIE, and in this case, transportation data, and doing that with ground truth data. The graph here shows a transportation study that we did in Boulder, Colorado, which involved a sample size of around 76,000 vehicles that passed 4 intersections over a 3-day period. And what we're seeing is the modeled total vehicle counts from EIE were within around 6.1% of the actual vehicle counts, which is very promising. Again, that's not to say there aren't exceptions. And so as mentioned, we're always very interested to work with cities and partners to try to see how this looks like in other parts of the country. Next slide. And then, yeah, just to reiterate, as far as data coverage, out of the data sets that I went through, the one that we definitely have the most coverage for is by far transportation. So when we say we have 40,000, we have data available to 40,000 geos and cities. That for the most part means we at the minimum have transportation available. And then from what we've typically seen, buildings would then follow as far as the number of places where we have buildings data, and then solar rooftop potential. Again, it's a free platform, so if you haven't signed up already, definitely encourage you to do so at insights.sustainability.google. Next slide. Just going to quickly go over these examples. I just have 2 here. Next slide. Here is just the 2019 GHG Inventory by the City of Hartford, where EIE data was used to establish the city's climate action plan, but in partnership with local volunteers and city staff. Local volunteers are also helping to calculate the city's baseline emissions. Next slide. And then here's another example with EIE being used for citywide solar technical assessment to design to not only develop the target, but a plan as for improving access to energy sources, reducing costs for residents, and creating jobs in the city of Houston. Next slide. Here, I wanted to talk a little bit about, as well as having our data available on our web platform, as I shared at insights.sustainability.google. We're also working with select partners to see how we can surface our data in other climate tools. And really our goal for exploring such integrations is we understand that there are tools that cities are using today that have access to other data sources that makes it easier to wrangle EIE data with those other data sources. And our goal with looking to explore to integrate some more tools is really so that we can reach more users and hopefully day-to-day workflows that suit their needs and reporting needs as well. So next slide. So our main example here in the US is we've worked with ICLEI USA as far as making our EIE data available in ClearPath. It's been a partnership that we've had going for quite some time now. It's been amazing to see just how users interact not only with our data, but also with ClearPath, and how it's just been very useful as far as streamlining the process for completing greenhouse gas inventories, forecasting, climate action plans, and of course, monitoring at the community-wide or government operation scales. And next slide. Yeah, I'm happy to share these links afterwards, but we do have a lot of materials as far as educational resources, reference materials that may be useful as you start developing or updating your GHG inventories, or if you are in the process of working on your climate action plans. And yeah, with that, that's the end of the presentation. Thanks again for everyone taking the time. I'm excited to work with you and hopefully be able to understand more of the priorities that your cities and communities are working on. And yeah, thanks again. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike, for your presentation. It's great to see how communities can use that Google Environmental Insights tool for their inventorying. And I just wanted to note, I'm starting to see questions pile into the Q&A box. Folks, please continue to add your questions into that Q&A box. We have another presentation to get through, and then we will open it up for the Q&A for the rest of the time we have here. So please continue to drop your questions into that Q&A box, and we'll get to your question then. Now I'm going to go ahead and pass it on over to Michelle and Laurel from the city of Nashville to talk about their inventory.
Hello. Hi, it's a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm Laurel Creech. I'm the Assistant Director of Sustainability for the City of Nashville. And I'm excited to be here with my team member, Michelle Hammond. She has been the lead on our greenhouse gas emissions inventories now for 3 inventories, which I'll touch on in just a moment. The next slide. So we are in the city of Nashville in Tennessee. We're right in the middle of the state, and we are a city-county consolidated government. So that means our city and county is all together. In fact, we were the first city in the United States to consolidate with our county. And so sometimes it makes things easier. Sometimes it makes things harder being a consolidated government. Our population as of last year was 691,000 people. That has already increased dramatically in just the past year. And in fact, Nashville is the top 10 metro area for population growth over the last 7 years. And we've had over 20% increase in just 1 decade. So we are increasing astronomically, and Michelle will talk a little bit about that and with how that relates to our greenhouse gas emissions. We are a mayor strong city. We have a mayor that is elected every 4 years, and they're term limited to 2 terms. So you can have a mayor for the max of 8 years. And we have a city council of 40 members for one of the largest city councils in the United States. We have 35 districts and 5 at-large members that represent the entire county. They're all elected, and they all are similar to the mayor in terms of 4-year terms and 2 term limits. The city of Nashville joined the Global Covenant of Mayors in 2015 and has been reporting to CDP and GCOM since that time on an annual basis. And in addition, I do want to mention that we did have a suite of sustainability legislative items that passed in 2019 around city operations, including moving towards 100% renewables, 100% electrification for our city fleet, and LEED requirements, as well as energy efficiency requirements for our built infrastructure. We do have a LEED mandate, but it's only for city buildings to be a minimum of LEED Gold in the urban area and LEED Silver in the more rural areas of the county. Next slide, please. Back in 2020, the current mayor of Nashville, Tennessee, appointed a sustainability advisory committee of about 50 members representing a really diverse representations of leadership and elected officials and citizens in our community. And they did develop a climate action report in specifically outlining many different strategies, over 300, which we stratified since then down to 40. The city does have a GHG reduction goal of 80% reduction for both municipal and community by 2050. We have not adopted a more recent goal other than that 2050, but we're considering that. Next. As I had mentioned to you, the work with the City of Nashville and sustainability has been going on for quite some time. Back in 2009, like many cities, larger cities across the United States did sign the Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement. And at that point, we did do 2 inventories in 2005 data and 2011 data. And then in 2014, we joined the Compact of Mayors and we did another inventory using 2014 data. And then in 2015, as I mentioned, we joined GCOM and we did another inventory using 2017 data. We also did a wedge analysis for our emissions. And then the Climate Action Report was just released last year, and we are just finished up our most recent inventory in 2019. You can see that it's about every 2 or 3 years, and we stay away from years that have anomalies. We also have been using the ClearPath platform since the 2014 inventory. So for 3 inventories, we've been using ClearPath. For the first 3 inventories, we did utilize outside consultants to manage the inventories. And on the last inventory in 2014, the consultants trained our team, Michelle Hammond being one of them, who's about to present. And since that time, we moved it in-house. So for 2017 and 2019 inventories, we did it all in-house. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Michelle to talk through that whole process.
Sure, thank you, Laurel. So as Laurel said, we have been doing the last 2 inventories in-house. So actually I joined Metro in September 2016 as an intern. And so for the 2014 inventory, I was working as an intern alongside the consultants, and then started doing it ourselves. So as just a little bit of an overview of these past inventories, as you can see, our emissions have been decreasing a little bit, but then the more important thing is that our community emissions per person has been going down. So our population has increased from about 550,000 in 2005 to about 700,000 in 2019. And our emissions per person went from about 26 metric tons per person in 2005 to about 16 metric tons per person in 2019. And also, you can also see on these graphs that the transportation emissions, that's in the dark blue, has been increasing as a share of our emissions, while the building sector, so the blue, the green, and the gray have been decreasing as a share of our emissions. I'd like to tell you a little bit about our process and how long it takes for our greenhouse gas inventories. It typically takes about 4 months from the time that we start till our inventory is done. The mayor's office typically sends the emails out to the different utilities, departments, and planning groups, and it takes about 2 months to gather the data. Our assistant director, Laurel, then leans in to make sure that we get all the data on time. We have 1 staff working on the community inventory data input and 1 staff for the municipal inventory. As Laurel said, we use ClearPath as the software tool to input our data. And it takes about 2 months to do the data entering. And we estimate during those 2 months, it's about 50% of our staff time, just to give you some idea. So other than these 4 months every 2 years to do the inventory, we also attend webinars, we read a lot and do research to keep up to date and to be able to use the most accurate methods. I know you can't read this, but this bottom part is what Kaylin has mentioned, the CDP upload, that we then upload our inventory from ClearPath into CDP. To tell you a little bit about what we've learned and our successes along the way, we use our CRF, the Common Reporting Framework, compliant inventories to provide us data points so that we can make mitigation decisions as a city. We've made improvements as we've learned through the past 3 inventories and the past 7 years of reporting. Our data quality have increased over time. For instance, our utilities, we have 1 main electricity utility and 1 natural gas utility, but their boundaries don't overlap with our county boundary. So in previous inventories, they were not able to give us exact energy usage numbers for the county, but their data quality has improved over time too. So this past inventory, we got exact energy usage from both utilities for our county boundary. We've made incremental improvements with every inventory. For instance, this last one that we just completed, we added helicopter live flights, police helicopter flights, and we were also able to separate our water and wastewater emissions into a different category. To give you an idea, we have about 11 facilities that had helicopter live flights, 11 hospitals in our county, and that was about 6,400 helicopter flights, and we have 6 police helicopters. Adding all of those helicopter data only added 0.1% to our transportation emissions. So my recommendation would be, don't start with that. Like Kaylin said, the on-road transportation is a way bigger part of the pie. And when you try to balance accuracy with the practicality, you don't need to start with the helicopter flights. But we were at a point where we felt that it was a good thing to add to our inventory. And also with the water and wastewater emissions, it took us a long time to figure out how many septic systems there are in Davidson County, and the fugitive emissions from septic systems are similarly only a small part of the water and wastewater emissions. We then use these inventories to have a detailed wedge analysis developed by a consultant, and both the greenhouse gas inventories and the wedge analysis has been instrumental in crafting our climate action plan. I also want to add, in addition to about the smaller parts like the helicopter flights and the septic test systems, the CRF only asks you to report on your significant emissions, and which means that the combined emissions from all sources deemed insignificant should not exceed 5% of the reported emissions. So don't get hung up on the insignificant parts of the inventory, but just focus on the significant emissions. Some of the lessons we've learned over the past inventories is that it's important to identify who's the keeper of the data. It's not always easy to find out where you can find the data. It also takes a long time to gather the data, sometimes longer than you expected, and you have to plan. One of our other obstacles have been the timing of when the data is available. So both the EIA and our transportation data are only available about 2 years later. So I know other cities sometimes do a more recent inventory. For instance, they would now be completing the 2021 inventory, and then they just make a notation that the transportation data is older, and then they update the inventory when the data becomes available. But we have made the decision not to do that, but to wait for our transportation data to actually be available before we conduct the inventory. We sometimes have a lot of technical questions that come up during our inventory. The complexity of the on-road modeling for transportation, we have 2 airports with very different mixes of airplanes. And also we have 3 different water utilities, and their boundaries differ from the county boundary. So figuring all of that out takes some time, but luckily there's a lot of educational training that's available, and we have used GCOM guidance, asking ICLEI staff. ICLEI conducted a workshop for our local power companies that fall under the Tennessee Valley Authority, and we attended the workshop with our local power company. And then we also have regional groups such as the Urban Sustainability Directors Network and the Southeast Sustainability Directors Network that we ask questions, attend webinars, and try to get our technical questions answered. I just want to end with saying that every city is different and has different priorities and funding. And so that makes each city's path unique, but there's a lot of resources that can help you in this process.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michelle and Laurel, for your presentation. It's always amazing to see the work that Nashville does. So it's really great to have you all on the call. And I definitely think that it was very beneficial for a lot of the cities, communities that are joining us today. So wonderful. We have about half an hour. I wanted to leave a lot of time for Q&A, as the inventory process is usually, seems to be, at least from what we've seen from the inventory, the GCOM insights, is that the inventory is usually the most difficult for communities, and we see a lot of the errors occurring in the inventory. So I wanted to leave a lot of time for Q&A. So we'll go ahead and jump into a Q&A session for the next half hour. If you have questions, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A box. And we already have a few in here, so I wanted to just go ahead and start with those, but please, as we're going along, please feel free to drop those in there. Great. So first question that I'm seeing is, how would we input environmental insights explorer data into our inventories, either into ClearPath or into Cirrus? I think that Mike's presentation kind of already went through some of the ClearPath integration. So the environmental insights data is already integrated into ClearPath. Essentially, you'll be able to log into your account and see on ClearPath and see the data in that in your inventory. But I'm not sure about Cirrus. I don't know if Mike, if you have an answer for that one.
Yeah, currently we don't have integration in place with Cirrus, but for non-ClearPath users, you can actually download the data on EIE, our web portal, and essentially you're downloading it in tablet format, so a CSV. So you would be able to kind of plug and play manually as you see fit. And so that's a great workaround if you're not able to use ClearPath.
Great. Yes, definitely. Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Mike. So next question I'll move into is, will this presentation be shared with the participants? Yes, we'll be sharing these slides. And I believe, yes, this is also being recorded. So we'll be sharing this recording and the slides out to all the registrants. Next question, this is, I think this is also for Google. It says, are we able to break down the non-residential building data further into categories like hospitals, government buildings, and et cetera?
Great question. Currently, our classifications are what they are. So essentially, it is really non-residential and residential. And if we're not able to make the assumption on our end, it's classified as unknown. That being said, it is worth noting that our estimates are derived from more fine-grained building type classifications. We are typically better with classifying non-residential buildings, mainly because we're leveraging inputs from Google Maps. So we do have a very good understanding as far as detecting hospitals, hotels, office space, retail, and warehouse. That being said, we are looking into more of that fine-grained detail that you're alluding to here. And so it's something definitely top of mind as we look into our roadmap. So while we don't currently surface those breakdowns, we definitely hear you loud and clear, and it's definitely something we'll be continuing to explore and hoping to be able to provide at some point, perhaps in the future.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Mike. Okay, next question. This is again about integration with EIE and ClearPath. Can you share more information on how/when EIE will be integrated into ClearPath? So it's already integrated into ClearPath. I think that what I don't know, it says anonymous, so I'm not sure who that is that asked that question. But if you reach out to, you can either reach out to myself or you can reach out to your membership advisor with ICLEI, and they will kind of show you how you can access that EIE data within your ClearPath account, because it should be in there for you already. So just, yeah, please feel free to reach out to myself or your membership advisor.
And just a quick note to add on top, with our transportation data, and apologies if I didn't make it clear, we do provide annual breakouts. So we go as far back as 2018, and we released earlier this year our 2021 transportation data. So something just to keep in mind as you get more acquainted with EIE and our transportation emissions and data available.
Great, that kind of leads into the next question a bit. That said, yeah, for transportation data, are we able to break it down by vehicle type to better understand the sources of emissions? I don't know if there's, yeah.
So yeah, happy to jump in here as well. So currently, as far as we do provide modal splits, and so automobile, rail, transit, walking, cycling. But as far as breaking down that bucket of automobile, we currently don't have further splits. And so it is really just bucketed under the category of automobile. And with transportation in general, I should probably put out, we mainly account for on-road transport, so directly from fuel combustion and indirectly EVs. But as far as seeing more detail on vehicle types, that's also something that we're looking into right now.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. And I think another question, one more that is specific to EIE is how can the community partner more directly with Google?
We have great partners in GCOM and ICLEI. And especially since we do have this integration with ClearPath, we definitely encourage cities and communities to reach out to us. And if you're a member of GCOM or ICLEI, probably best to reach your point of contact, and it will rest assured it will get to me, and I'm happy to support. Just we like to work with our network partners here because we understand, certainly we appreciate their local expertise, and we think that's probably the best way for us to collaborate and really work together.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. Okay, so another question. If other towns are contributing to a landfill located in your town, how do you separate what is coming from your town versus theirs? And so typically what you'll want to do is if the inventory, if the landfill is located within your town, you'll typically want to account for the emissions from that landfill as a whole. You want to account for those emissions. But the most important thing, so if you don't want to do that, the most important thing to make sure you're accounting for is what is generated within your community. And the best way to do that is to work with like waste management or your solid waste provider to kind of, because they should have a breakdown from their system on how much waste is coming from your city versus other cities. So the best way is to check with them instead of just going directly to the landfill. I don't know if Michelle or Laurel, if you wanted to answer that, or.
Our trash is actually going to a landfill outside Davidson County. We have the opposite problem. So
no worries. Yeah, great. So this next question though is specifically for Nashville. It says, what is 50% of staff time? How many staff are utilizing 50% of their time for the inventory?
So there's just two of us doing the input of the data. I do the input of the community inventory, and then my colleague Freddie do the input for the municipal inventory. So it's just two of us, 50% of our time, and then Laurel helps with getting the data and getting everything that we need for the input.
And that's just for the 4 months of period when we're engaged in updating the inventory. So for 4 months, that Michelle and Freddie's staff time is about 50% of their time is dedicated to the inventory project.
Great. And I think I wanted to just add that I think something that we've seen that helps a lot of communities kind of get through their inventory a lot faster. I think Nashville is a wonderful example that they can get through their inventory in 4 months, but we do have a lot of cities where it takes them a lot longer than that. I think a really great way to kind of shorten that time, and Nashville has done that, is build more relationships with the utilities that you are, that service your community. So your electricity or your gas company or your landfill or your wastewater treatment facility, making sure that you build up that relationship so that they know, what type of project you're working on, so they'll have that data readily available. Because we've ran into a couple of issues where some utilities just didn't understand why the city was even asking for the data, so that just took longer to actually get the data. So building up that relationship is pretty essential as well. Great, thank you so much for answering that one. We have a few more questions in the chat or in the Q&A box. So this is from Kranti from Fremont. Thank you so much for your question. Since Nashville has joined the local government with the county, did you report jointly on the city and county's inventory, or were they separated?
It's a consolidated government structure, so we don't separate anything. It's all, Davidson County is Nashville.
Great, thank you so much. Awesome.
Or I'm not exactly, or is the question municipal? We do have a separate municipal inventory. That's just city operations. I'm not exactly sure if the question was about the city operations or the physical city.
Yeah, Kranti, if you wanted to elaborate a bit on on that and whether the oh, she was okay. They were just I was just curious about the city versus the county. So thank you for that. Great. Next is once EIE data is requested, how quickly is it available?
I can jump in here. So I'm assuming this question relates to when you, and correct me if I'm wrong, is when you go to our website and you haven't had access, you sign up for it, and the turnaround. Usually we try to get it as soon as we can, within a couple of days, but of course, sometimes it can get missed just by virtue of we do get quite a steady flow of interested inquiries and registrations. And so if for whatever reason you don't hear back, of course you can reach out to your GCOM or ICLEI representative. And there's also, we do have a contact email as well that you can reach out to, and we're usually really good about responding. I do want to hint that, and not to explain why there might be a delay, but sometimes there may also not be a response because we don't have data for that region. And so we are working on our messaging so that if that is actually the case, that we can at least inform you so that you're not left wondering if we have data and you're simply just waiting to get access.
Great. Thank you for that. Okay, trying to see some other questions that we have here. Okay, they said thank you for that, Mike. Great. So another question. I'm concerned about the amount of staff time it takes to crunch data. I understand the importance, but I wonder if there can be some shifting of staff resources into action instead of data collection. Yes, so this is something that we, I think most of us GCOM partners and most of us are working to support communities with, because we definitely want communities to focus more on the actual implementation of strategies to reduce those emissions, especially when with the Paris Agreement and the Race to Zero, we're looking at 8 years from now, where we need significant emission reduction in order to achieve that 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And so I think that the best thing is to kind of, as I was mentioning in my presentation, really kind of focusing in on those sectors that are the most important. So those would be, again, energy, your electricity and natural gas usage, your transportation, specifically the on-road emissions, because those are typically the largest emission sources for communities. And then it was your solid waste generated by your community, and the energy for your wastewater and potable water treatment facilities. So I think that specifically focusing on those 5 emission sources is a great way to kind of narrow down on your inventory, but still understand the picture of what is causing the most emissions from your community. So that will be less time spent on data collection for other sources, and then you can really get into the planning and implementation of your different strategies. And then in terms of reporting, then, you know, it's again, you'll want to focus in on those and those 5 that I mentioned. And still, when you're reporting, you'll still want to make sure you're utilizing those notation keys for the other sectors that were not included. But again, we really want you to focus on those really main sectors that I kind of mentioned there. So yeah, I don't know if anyone else wanted to respond to that as well.
I think we kind of already covered it with City of Nashville, but like you had mentioned, the importance of developing those relationships with the utilities help streamline things. The fact that we have a template, we have a process, and we have consistency with our staff, that Michelle and Freddie, who is executing the inventory every year, certainly helps with that. That would be really challenging if we didn't have those in place. And I know that it would be much more time consuming to do that. So, and that's another reason why we didn't go out with consultants again, because they often change and you have to retrain them. So that's why we wanted to take in-house. But consistency and relationship developing definitely helps streamline the process.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so we have a few more questions. See, we have about 11 minutes left, so we'll try to get through these last couple of questions here. Okay, so this question is, how do you explain to decision makers that they should make climate impact decisions based on 2+ year-old inventory data? And I think I can take a stab at this, and then Michelle and Laurel and Mike, if you want, if there's anything you want to add, please feel free to. But I think that, you know, with inventorying, you know, ICLEI, we always recommend to do a inventory about every 2 to 3 years, because between say you do a 2018 and 2019 year inventory year, you're not going to see that much of a difference between your emissions. And so really that 2-year-old or 3-year-old inventory is really a great picture of the emissions that are going on in your community at the moment. So it is what is about the best kind of time frame for you to conduct those inventories. And then looking at, I think Laura and Michelle had mentioned this a bit in their presentation, you know, right now, a lot of communities, because of the pandemic, a 2020 inventory is not necessarily what we want to be looking at because of the anomalies that were created in those emissions. Transportation data went way down for a lot of communities, commercial buildings, those emissions went down for a lot of communities. So it's not going to be the norm. And so if you base your emissions off of that, and then you do an inventory for 2021 and they go back up, you know, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. So a lot of communities, what we've seen so far, are doing like a 2019, basing a lot of their climate action plans now off of that 2019 inventory, skipping that 2020, and then either doing that 2021 inventory, and then, well, 2022 is, that data won't be available till around June of next year. But yeah, I think that it's just great to let them know that this, like a 2-year-old or 3-year-old inventory, is the best picture that you'll be able to get, and doing your inventories in those increments is the best option. Yeah, I don't know if anyone wanted to add on to that.
I was just going to mention that we did get a consultant to do a wedge analysis and business as usual analysis that did some projections for us, and that was very helpful because it could take that moment in time and project that out 3 to 5, 7, 10 plus years and really identify what to focus on. And I think there's probably tools now available where you could probably do that type of analysis in-house and maybe not have to have a consultant do it, but that was very valuable to us and helped inform our climate action plan.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Okay, so we have 4 more questions. And I think 3 of them look like they are about Google EIE, so I'm just gonna go ahead with those. So first one is, could Google just publish their inferred land use with the public? I'm not sure exactly what that question is referring to. So if you want to kind of clarify that, I think that would be great. But yeah, Mike, the question was, could Google publish their inferred land use with the public?
Yeah, I think I'm with you there, Kaylin, as far as a little bit more detail may make my answer a little bit more useful, but reading between the lines, you know, in some ways I do feel like we do make that data available just with our different products, as you know, with the level of detail that we have in, say, Google Earth and Google Maps. But I think sounds like there's more of a specific use case attached to this question. So, you know, I guess to take a step back, I think usually, as with all decisions, particularly in context of EIE, we just want to make sure that we are creating features and visuals that would benefit our users at large. Though we totally understand the importance of being able to capture those local nuances, we also face that, trying to find that sweet spot of where we want to make sure that we don't do anything too custom that we can't create and benefit all of our users.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. Mauricio, I hope that answers the question, but again, please feel free to clarify if you have. Oh, so thanks. All right, great, awesome. Okay, so next was, can users of EIE get data or analysis for smaller areas smaller than city scale? So like subdivision in a city.
Great question. And I guess the short answer is it really depends on which city or community that we're talking for additional data. The main reason is due to an effort to maintain privacy. EIE currently does not display origin or destination or to any geographic boundary where the population is below around 30,000. And the reason why I say around is because year over year, and depending on which population model you use, the numbers may vary. But we use World Pop as far as what our reference towards population for cities. But that being said, with the population threshold aside, usually for bigger cities, we do have more granular data available. That being said, so you may get some districts, you may get some boroughs, but that's usually more likely to be the case in bigger urban areas. So definitely encourage you to, if you haven't signed up already, to sign up. And also, if there's interest to also see, you don't have to just sign up for your own city. You can sign up for neighboring cities or towns within your cities. So definitely invite you and encourage you to go through the registration, and you can get a sense of, well, where we have data. And for those who are on the fence about signing up, you can also go to our public website. Again, that's insights.sustainability.google. If you scroll down, you'll see a coverage map. And on that coverage map, you'll see, as denoted by pins on the map, where we have data geographically, and you can kind of zoom in and out to be able to get a little bit more detail. So definitely check that out.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. We have 3 minutes left and we have some more questions coming in. So I'm going to try to get through these as best as we can. But also, if we don't get to your question, please feel free to email the GCOM Help Desk support email, and we'll try to get to your answer there. But one of the questions here I see is for both Google and Nashville. So this is from Cupertino in California. And this is wondering if the EIE platform is being used to estimate carbon sequestration from trees or tree canopy. And also to Nashville folks, if you plan on adding carbon sequestration to your inventory.
So I can take that real quick. As far as tree canopy, so currently this is tree canopy is our pilot, is one of our beta insights, if you will. So it's definitely one that we don't have as much data coverage compared to our other data sets. Currently, if you go to the webpage, publicly available, so without sign up, you can see what that data looks like, and it's available for, if I'm not mistaken, 15 US cities. And you'll mainly, right now, we've really focused on really being able to map that coverage as far as tree canopy, and also pairing it with social economic data. So you're able to not only look at the effects of urban heat island, but also be able to start being able to make some assumptions and correlations between equity and seeing how that translate and affects tree canopy coverage in general. But as far as carbon sequestration, we do hear that a lot, and that's something that we're aware is important. But currently what we have is more or less what you see. So definitely encourage you to check out that data. We are on a plan to expand that. So from the 15 that you see on our public website today, the goal is to hopefully by year's end expand that to hopefully to hundreds of cities. And so, yeah, as with all our other data sets, it's that fine line of trying to balance between trying to unlock more data for more cities and communities, or and how many features and as far as data granularity is concerned, yeah, how much do we surface? So yeah, age-old problem, but and the same applies to tree canopy.
Great. We are at time. So I again, if we did not get to your question, please feel free to reach out to the GCOM Help Desk email. So I'm just going to share my screen so you can see that email really quickly here. So yeah, so if we did not get to your question, please reach out to the support help desk email, and we'll get to your question. But I wanted to thank everyone for joining us for this session today. Thank you all for the wonderful questions and being really engaging webinar. And then also thank you so much to our speakers here. So thank you so much to Mike from Google for presenting about the Google Environmental Insights Explorer, and also to City of Nashville, Laurel and Michelle, for presenting on the wonderful work that you all do within your region. So again, thank you all so much, and we will be following up with the next session, the next webinar, which will be occurring around October. But again, thank you all so much. We'll send out the slides and the recording, and we'll be following up very shortly. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time.